My sister stole $120,000 from our mother's retirement account, told the entire family I did it, watched my uncle humiliate me at Thanksgiving while the room applauded, and never once considered that the brother she framed was the brother whose lawyer had the bank records. Subreddit 34M, Everett. I underwrite commercial insurance in Charlotte. What that means in practice is I spend my days deciding whether something is worth the risk. I look at the exposure, calculate the probable loss, and determine whether the premium covers the damage. I've done this for 11 years and I'm good at it. And I'm telling you this because I spent 34 years underwriting my own family without realizing it, absorbing every claim they filed against me, paying out every loss they created, and never once raising the premium or denying coverage, until my sister Phoebe filed a claim so large that the policy collapsed and the adjuster, which was me, finally did what adjusters do when the fraud is obvious. I denied the claim, reported the loss, and canceled the policy. The loss was $120,000. The fraud was my sister. And the policy I canceled was the 34-year arrangement where I absorbed everything and filed nothing. My mother, Lorraine, is 61. Retired after 33 years as an office manager. Rolled her 401k into an IRA worth approximately $340,000, which was supposed to fund 3 decades of retirement, and which now funds roughly 18 because my sister removed $120,000 over 14 months while I was in Charlotte calculating other people's risks and assuming my own family wasn't one. Phoebe is 31, 3 years younger. The daughter Lorraine shielded, funded, and excused for 31 years running. Not because Phoebe was fragile, because Lorraine decided Phoebe was fragile the way I decide a building is high risk. She made the assessment early, and the assessment became the policy, and the policy dictated all future coverage. Phoebe cried when things were hard. I processed and moved forward. And in a family where tears are treated as a valid claim and composure is treated as proof you weren't damaged, the person who cries gets the payout, and the person who copes gets the premium increase. I have been absorbing claims my entire life. Every unequal decision, every sacrifice that only went one direction, every moment where Phoebe received and I adjusted, I processed it the way I process claims at work. Assess the damage, accept the loss, move on, don't file. The word for this in my industry is self-insured. I was self-insured against my own family. I covered every loss out of pocket and never reported the damage to anyone because reporting requires admitting the damage exists, and admitting the damage exists requires acknowledging that the people causing it are the people who were supposed to protect you from it. And that acknowledgement is the most expensive claim a person can file. One example, because one is enough to show the pattern. Lorraine promised both of us a used car at 18. Phoebe got hers on her birthday. A Honda Civic, $6,500, title transferred, full tank of gas, bow on the hood. My 18th birthday, 4 months later. We're stretched thin right now, sweetheart. You understand. I understood. I understood that stretched thin applied to me specifically and funded applied to Phoebe specifically, and the stretch was always in my direction. I bought my own car at 19 with savings from a grocery store job where I worked 4 nights a week through senior year. The Civic was a gift. My car was a claim I paid myself. And nobody in the family registered the disparity because the disparity was the system, and the system had been in place so long that questioning it felt like questioning gravity. There were other claims. Phoebe's apartment after college, first and last month covered by Lorraine. Mine, a security deposit I saved from 9 months at the grocery store. Claim processed. Loss absorbed. Filed away. Phoebe's 3 breakups between 22 and 27. Lorraine drove hours, sat on couches, held hands, absorbed tears. My breakups. A text that said, "Sorry to hear that, you'll bounce back." 5 words. The emotional equivalent of a claim denial. We acknowledge the event, but the coverage doesn't extend to this type of loss. Every time I noted the disparity, I did what I do at work. I recalculated the premium. The premium for being in this family kept going up and the coverage kept going down, and by the time I was 30, I was paying the highest premium in the portfolio and receiving the least coverage, and the adjuster, which was Lorraine, kept approving Phoebe's claims and denying mine, and nobody audited the adjuster because the adjuster was the mother and mothers don't get audited. Until they do. Phoebe's career, if you can call a series of departures a career, has been 11 jobs in 9 years. 3 terminated, 5 resigned, 2 laid off, 1 current. Every exit was reframed as somebody else's fault. Every gap between jobs was subsidized by Lorraine. The subsidizing was never tracked because tracking requires the word no, and Lorraine has never said no to Phoebe because no creates a claim, and Phoebe's claims are loud, and loud claims get processed first in any system, including families. The boutique is not part of this story. Phoebe didn't open a store. What Phoebe did was simpler and worse. She logged into our mother's retirement account with credentials she'd set up 2 years earlier when she helped Lorraine navigate the online brokerage after retirement. Because Lorraine doesn't understand technology and Phoebe does, and the person who sets up the account is the person who holds the key. And the person who holds the key held it for 14 months and used it to transfer $120,000 into her own checking account at a different bank in amounts small enough to avoid institutional alerts and large enough to sustain a life she could not afford on her own income. What Phoebe spent it on? Not a mansion, not a sports car. The slow, invisible bleed of a woman living 30% above her means. Rent on a 1-bedroom she had no business leasing. Credit card minimums she'd been drowning under for 3 years. Student loan payments she'd deferred twice. And a 10-day trip to Portugal with her boyfriend that she told the family was his gift. It was not his gift. It was Lorraine's retirement, repackaged as romance and posted on Instagram with sunset captions and the word blessed, while the woman whose money funded the sunsets was scrolling the photos and commenting heart emojis, not knowing the hearts were being charged to her own account. The Portugal trip is the detail that wakes me up at night. $8,400. 10 days. Lisbon rooftops. Porto wine cellars. Phoebe posted a photo at the Tagus River at sunset and Lorraine commented, "My beautiful girl living her best life. My beautiful girl living her best life." Funded by her mother's retirement. Endorsed by the woman being stolen from. And I was in Charlotte at my desk underwriting risk for strangers while my sister was in Portugal spending my mother's future, and my mother was double-tapping the photos and calling it beautiful. How I found out? Not from the family. From a compliance flag. Lorraine's financial advisor, a man named Paulson, called me in September because I'm listed as emergency contact on the account. He'd noticed a pattern, irregular withdrawals, increasing frequency, transfers to an external account that wasn't Lorraine's. He was careful with his words the way financial professionals are when they suspect fraud but need the family to confirm it. I called Lorraine. She didn't know. She checked the balance while I was on the phone and I heard her breathing change. The specific sound of a woman watching a number on a screen that is drastically smaller than the number in her memory, and the gap between the screen and the memory was $120,000, and the gap was her daughter. This is where the story splits from what you might expect. I expected Lorraine to be devastated. I expected us to figure this out together. I expected the mother whose retirement was stolen to be on the same side as the son who discovered the theft. I was wrong, because Phoebe got to Lorraine first. When Lorraine panicked and called Phoebe about the flagged account, Phoebe did not confess. Phoebe called Lorraine back within hours, crying, and told her that I was the one who took the money. She cited my medical power of attorney, which is real, and claimed I had used it to access the brokerage account, which is false, because medical POA does not grant financial access, and anyone who spent 30 seconds examining the difference would know this. But Phoebe wasn't betting on examination. She was betting on tears. And tears have a 30-year winning record in this family. Then Lorraine did something I did not expect, and that changed the nature of the crime from Phoebe's theft to a family conspiracy. When I called Lorraine to explain that medical POA cannot authorize financial transactions, Lorraine said, "Phoebe, show me the documents. She says you had access. Show me the documents." Phoebe hadn't just accused me on the phone. She had gone to Lorraine's house and presented fabricated evidence. A printout of my medical POA with handwritten notes suggesting it authorized financial activity. Lorraine saw the printout. Lorraine accepted the printout. And Lorraine, when I asked her directly, "Mom, do you believe I stole from you?" said, "I don't know what to believe, Everett, but the paperwork is right here." The paperwork was right there. Fabricated by the person who stole the money and validated by the mother who couldn't face the alternative, which was that the daughter she protected for 31 years was the daughter she needed protection from. Phoebe ran a campaign, called every family member individually. Uncle Hank, Aunt Vivian, cousins, crying each time. Same detailed lie. Everett had access. Everett took the money. Everett is punishing Lorraine. By the time I learned about the accusation from my cousin Nadia, who called and said carefully, Everett, Phoebe is telling people you took money from your mom's account. The jury had already returned its verdict. Not one person in the family called me to ask if it was true. Not one. The crier accused. The coper was convicted. And the conviction was delivered without a trial because trials require evidence, and this family runs on tears. Thanksgiving. Lorraine's house. 22 people. I walked in with my wife Greer at 2 p.m. The room adjusted. That specific atmospheric pressure change when a group of people who have collectively decided you are guilty processes your physical presence. Shortened eye contact. Lowered voices. The choreography of a family that has convicted you and is managing the discomfort of your attendance. 45 minutes of strained small talk. Then Hank stood up. 63. Lorraine's brother. Retired plumber. The kind of man who has been certain about everything for 6 decades because he has never examined anything long enough to discover uncertainty. He picked up his wine glass, looked at me across the table, and said, Lorraine has worked her whole life. 33 years. And her own son stole from her retirement. You should be ashamed of yourself, Everett. The room clapped. Not all 22. But enough. The specific sound of hands confirming a verdict they never researched, delivered by a man who never saw a bank statement, about a crime committed by the woman sitting across from me. Phoebe. I watched her during Hank's speech. Eyes down, hands folded in her lap. She didn't stop Hank. Didn't say wait. Didn't correct the lie. She sat in the sound of the clapping the way a person sits in a room they built. Comfortably, knowing where everything is, having arranged the furniture herself. I said nothing. In my industry, when a claim is fraudulent, you don't argue with the claimant at the scene. You document. You investigate. You build the file. And you deny the claim with evidence so organized that the denial is not a conversation but a conclusion. The Thanksgiving table was the scene. The clapping was the fraudulent claim. And the file was being built by a lawyer named Mr. Keene, whose office was 18 miles from the turkey. Greer squeezed my hand under the table. Twice. Our signal. After dinner, I cleared the table. Helped wash the dishes. In a house where I'd just been called a thief by a room that applauded the accusation. I did it because clearing is what I do. Processing claims is what I do. Absorbing damage without visible reaction is what I do. Except this time the damage was being logged, and the log was going to a lawyer, and the lawyer was going to present it in a room where the clapping would stop. In the car, Greer was quiet for 4 blocks. Then, you washed their dishes. They called you a thief, and you washed their dishes. You've been processing their claims so long you don't know how to stop, even when the claim is against you. She was crying. The angry kind. I pulled over. Held her hand. Said, January 8th. She said, January 8th. The date was the denial. The date was the file. The date was the end of the policy. 6 weeks of silence between Thanksgiving and January 8th. 6 weeks of being a thief in a family that didn't call to verify. Not one person picked up the phone and said, Everett, did you do this? Because asking invites a denial, and a denial from the coper carries less weight than an accusation from the crier, and the weight differential is the system, and the system operated flawlessly for 6 weeks while Mr. Keene built the file. 6 weeks is a long time to carry a label you didn't earn. I'd wake up and the first thought wasn't the accusation. The first thought was the clapping. The sound of hands. The sound of agreement. The sound of a room confirming that the version of me Phoebe had sold was the version they'd bought, and the purchase was non-refundable, and the receipt was Hank's speech, and the speech was applauded, and the applause was the most expensive sound I'd ever heard because it cost me a family, and it cost nothing to produce. Greer and I developed a routine during those 6 weeks. We didn't talk about it every day. We talked about the porch swing, the house, the plans. We talked about the future as if the future was intact. Because the future was intact, the future was just taking a detour through a lawyer's office before arriving at the porch we'd been planning since our second date. And the detour was 6 weeks long, and the detour was paved with silence, and the silence was mine, and I chose it, because the correction was coming, and the correction would be louder than any defense I could have offered at a dinner table between the turkey and the pie. Mr. Keene, financial crimes attorney. Greer found him through a colleague at her firm. Keene subpoenaed the bank records. Every transfer traced to Phoebe's checking account. IP logs traced to Phoebe's apartment and phone. login credentials set up from Phoebe's email, and a letter from the brokerage firm confirming that the medical power of attorney I hold does not and has never authorized financial transactions. The file was clean. Every document was a correction. Every correction was a clap played in reverse. January 8th, Lorraine's living room. Smaller gathering. Lorraine, Phoebe, Hank, Aunt Vivian, me, Greer, Mr. Keene. I said, "This is my attorney. He has the bank records from Mom's retirement account. I've spent 6 weeks being called a thief by this family without a single person asking me if the accusation was true. The evidence will speak for me since my voice wasn't considered worth hearing." Keene opened the file. Flat. Factual. The professional monotone of a man presenting findings that don't require emphasis because the content provides its own. Transfer records. IP logs. Login traces. Phoebe's bank statements showing deposits matching the withdrawal dates and amounts. And the brokerage letter confirming my POA was medical only. Each page landed in the room like a weight being placed on a scale that the family thought was already balanced, and that was actually tilted so far it had been resting on the floor. Lorraine's face. Not just surprise. Recognition. The specific expression of a woman who is watching evidence confirms something she already suspected but chose not to examine because examination would have meant confronting her own role. She had accepted Phoebe's fabricated printout. She had nodded when Hank spoke at Thanksgiving. Not the nod of a woman who was confused. The nod of a woman who had chosen a side and was maintaining the choice because changing sides would mean admitting she had participated in framing her own son, and the admission was more frightening than the fraud. Mr. Keene asked Lorraine a direct question. "Mrs. Harlow, when did you first suspect the withdrawals might be connected to Phoebe rather than Everett?" Lorraine's face crumbled. Not from surprise. From the weight of a question she had been avoiding since September. She said, very quietly, "November. Before Thanksgiving. Phoebe called me and slipped. She mentioned a specific withdrawal amount that I hadn't told her about. Only someone who made the withdrawal would know the exact number. I noticed. I didn't say anything. November. Before Thanksgiving. She knew, or suspected enough that the suspicion should have stopped the Thanksgiving accusation from happening. She sat at that table knowing something was wrong with Phoebe's story, and she let Hank stand up, and she let the room clap, and she let me sit there absorbing a claim she had evidence to deny. Lorraine didn't just fail to protect me. She actively processed the fraudulent claim against me while holding evidence that the claim was false. In my industry, that's called bad faith adjustment. And bad faith adjustment is not a mistake. It's a decision. Phoebe cried. Of course she cried. The tears that had been her operating system for 31 years. I was in trouble. I was drowning. Nobody was helping me. What was I supposed to do? What was I supposed to do? As if stealing from your mother and framing your brother and sitting silently while 22 people clapped for a lie you constructed was the only available option for a woman who was drowning, and as if drowning justifies pulling someone else under. Lorraine looked at Phoebe, and the expression on Lorraine's face shifted from recognition to something harder, something that had been building for 6 weeks, or maybe for 31 years, and she said one word. Enough. Not no. Not stop. Enough. The word of a woman who has reached the limit of what she can absorb, which is fitting because absorbing without limit is the family disease, and the disease was finally symptomatic in the person who had been the carrier. Aunt Vivian stood up and left. Didn't say a word. Just stood, picked up her purse, and walked out. She called me 2 days later. Not to apologize. To say something worse. I knew something was off about Phoebe's story. The timeline didn't add up. But I didn't say anything because your mother seemed so certain, and questioning your mother felt like a bigger risk than questioning the accusation. Questioning your mother felt like a bigger risk. The family's risk assessment laid bare. The risk of confronting Lorraine was higher than the risk of letting an innocent man be publicly accused, because Lorraine is the matriarch, and the matriarch sets the premium, and the premium for disagreeing with the matriarch is exclusion, and exclusion is the family's version of policy cancellation, and nobody wanted their policy canceled. So they let mine get canceled instead. And the letting was a consensus decision made by 22 people who calculated the risk of silence and decided the silence was cheaper than the truth. Hank tried to speak. Now hold on. Let's not. I cut him off. First time in my life I cut off Hank. Hank, you stood up at Thanksgiving with a wine glass and called me a thief in front of 22 people. They clapped. You led the clapping. You didn't ask for evidence. You didn't call me. You didn't spend 30 seconds verifying the accusation before you delivered it as a verdict. You believed Phoebe because Phoebe cried. You accused me because I didn't. That is not a mistake. That is underwriting. You assessed the risk of each child's claim, assigned credibility based on volume instead of evidence, and approved the loudest claim without reviewing the file. I review files for a living. Your underwriting was negligent, and negligent underwriting is how losses happen. Hank sat. The room was silent. The silence of people whose participation in something wrong has just been described in language they can't argue with because the language is professional and precision is harder to dismiss than emotion. I looked at Phoebe. She was still crying. I said, in the same calm I use when presenting a denial to a claimant whose case has been reviewed and rejected, Phoebe, you stole $120,000 from our mother. You got caught because a financial advisor flagged the withdrawals. Your first response was not to confess. Your first response was to accuse me. You used a real medical document to build a false case. You called every person in this family individually, crying, selling a story you knew was fabricated. You sat at Thanksgiving and watched 22 people clap for a lie you built, and you didn't say a word. Not one word. You let me be convicted in a room full of people I've known my entire life. People who have eaten my food and attended my wedding and held my wife's hand. And you let them clap for a fraud you committed because stopping the clapping would have meant admitting the fraud, and the fraud was easier to maintain than the admission. I don't need your apology. An apology from you has the same credibility as the accusation, which is zero. What I need is for you to understand that the coverage is canceled. Permanently. I am no longer absorbing claims from you. This is the last conversation we will have about what you did, because what you did is now in a file with Mr. Keene and a report with the police and a record with 3 financial institutions, and files don't need conversations. Files need processing, and the processing is underway. Phoebe was charged with elder financial abuse and theft. Lorraine agreed to pursue legal action after the January meeting, which was the first time in 31 years that Lorraine prioritized evidence over tears. Phoebe's checking account was frozen. The Portugal trip was entered into the record. $8,400 of retirement funds spent on a vacation the boyfriend didn't know was stolen. The boyfriend found out. They broke up within a month. The Instagram photos are still up. The hearts from Lorraine are still visible. The word blessed is still in the caption. And the caption now reads like evidence because it is. Lorraine and I have spoken 3 times since January. Short calls. Careful. The way you communicate with someone who participated in your framing and who is now trying to find the line between accountability and relationship, and the line doesn't exist yet because the line requires honesty, and honesty is new territory for a woman who spent 31 years avoiding it. She said on the second call, I shouldn't have believed her without asking you. I said, you didn't just believe her. You nodded when Hank accused me. You confirmed the lie with your body in a room full of people. She was quiet. The quiet of a woman who cannot deny a thing she did in front of 22 witnesses. I said, I'm not asking for an apology. I'm asking for you to understand why the policy is canceled. She said, what policy? I said, the one where I absorb everything and file nothing. That policy. It's canceled. Any future claims go through proper channels, which means evidence first, tears second. If you can operate under those terms, we can talk. If you can't, the line stays where it is. She said, I can try. Trying is not the same as doing. But trying is the first premium payment on a new policy, and I'll accept the first payment and see if the second one arrives. Of the 22 people at Thanksgiving, 3 called to apologize. 19 didn't. My best friend Bishop, an actuary who thinks in probabilities the way I think in risk, said 3 out of 22. That's a 13.6% apology rate. In my field, we'd call that a low-frequency event with high severity. The severity being that 86.4% of your family clapped for a fraud and then went silent when the fraud was proven. That's not a family. That's a poorly managed portfolio. Heavy on liability. Light on assets. Bishop is an actuary. Actuaries don't do metaphors. That was a metaphor, which means even the man who doesn't do metaphors thought the situation required one. Bishop came over last weekend. Sat on the porch swing. He's not a porch swing man. Bishop is a man who sits in office chairs and calculates mortality tables and who considers outdoor furniture a form of optimism he hasn't been trained for. But he sat. And he swung. And he looked at the yard and the street and the evening light. And he said, "You know what the swing is?" I said, "A swing." He said, "It's a zero-claim zone. Nobody on this porch is filing against you. Nobody on this porch is calculating your exposure. The swing just swings. The chains just hold. And you just sit. Bishop doesn't do sentiment." That was sentiment. Which means even the man who calculates death for a living thought the porch swing was worth noting, and the noting was the most human thing Bishop has done since he cried at his daughter's birth, which he later described as an actuarially significant emotional event. My cousin Nadia, a paralegal who was the first person to warn me about the accusation, texted after the meeting. "The file was devastating. You had every right. I'm sorry I didn't do more." Nadia, the only person inside the system who saw the system clearly and who named what she saw even when the naming was a whisper. Her whisper was louder than Hank's wine glass. "Greer and I bought a house last spring. Not the house we were looking at before the accusation. A different one. One street over from the original, which is the kind of geographic proximity that feels like a metaphor because it is one. The life we planned is one street over from where it was supposed to be, close enough to see, different enough to be ours. The house has a wraparound porch. Greer wanted a porch swing, the kind her grandmother had in South Carolina. Wooden slats, chain suspension, wide enough for two. She'd been talking about it since our second date, the porch swing, and the porch swing was always attached to a house, and the house was always attached to a future, and the future was the thing that almost didn't happen because my sister stole from my mother and my mother helped frame me for it. We bought the porch swing 3 weeks after closing. Hung it together on a Saturday morning. Greer sat in it and pushed off with her foot, and it swung, slowly, the way porch swings swing when the chains are right and the weight is balanced. And she said, "This is it. Not this is nice. Not this is what I wanted. This is it." The sentence of a woman who has been carrying the image of a porch swing since her grandmother's house, and who is now sitting in one that belongs to her, and that was earned, and that was not funded by anyone else's retirement, and that swings on chains that were hung by a man who spent 34 years absorbing claims, and who finally filed one of his own, and whose filing changed the terms, and whose changed terms produced a porch and a swing and a Saturday morning where nobody is accusing anyone of anything, and the only sound is the chain and the wood and the foot pushing off and the quiet. I spent 34 years paying claims for this family. Every car I didn't get. Every tuition I covered myself. Every disparity I absorbed. Every Thanksgiving where I sat quietly while the system operated around me. 34 years of claims, processed, paid, and filed away without a word. The report I filed in October was the first claim I ever submitted for myself. And the claim was approved. And the payout was not money. The payout was the sound of a room going silent when the evidence was presented, and the sound of a woman saying enough, and the sound of a porch swing on a Saturday morning, and the sound of nothing being owed to anyone, which is the quietest and most expensive sound I've ever heard. And I hear it every morning when I sit on the porch with coffee and Greer sits next to me, and the swing moves, and the claims are closed, and the policy is new, and the premium is honesty, and the coverage, finally, includes me. Saturday morning. The porch. Coffee. Greer next to me in the swing. Her feet are up. Mine are pushing. The chains creak the way chains creak on a porch swing that has been used every morning for 3 months. And the creaking is my favorite sound, because the creaking is a sound that belongs to nobody's claim and nobody's accusation and nobody's tears. It is the sound of wood and metal and weight and mourning and the specific piece of a man who spent 34 years self-insured against his own family and who finally filed the claim that changed the terms. The terms are different now. The coverage is different. The premium is honesty. And the policyholder, for the first time, is me. If this story hit close to home, drop a like, subscribe, and share your own in the comments. We'll catch you in the next one.